Hey y'all, and welcome to this video. Today's question is, how did Americans come together to compromise during the early years of the new nation? There's a lot to unpack, so let's get started.
Welcome back. We left off chatting about preparing for the revolution, writing the Declaration, and then actually the war beginning. And now we're fast forwarding with this discussion to the end of the war. So yay, we won. The British surrendered at Yorktown. The year was 1781. And while we were still fighting and preparing for the end of the war, we knew what we wanted. So in that same body of government, the Second Continental Congress that we've already discussed, they knew exactly what they thought they wanted, what they thought they needed, which was a government that was very weak. They individually, as colonies turned states, wanted to retain their sovereignty, their autonomy, and not have any government telling them what to do. They had just overthrown this monarchy, this king, and this tyrant. They didn't want to create that again in this new country. So they very consciously chose a confederation, which is a body of government, very loosely organized, very weak, again, intentionally, because they wanted South Carolina and Massachusetts and Georgia to be uniquely autonomous and rely on themselves. Within a confederation, they rely on each other for economics, for trade, and for defense of the whole. But individually, they're very sovereign and separate. So that's what they decided they wanted, and they wrote that all up in something called the Articles of Confederation, which was also in 1781. So that was how we became this new country. We were all very, very separate. Other confederations that you might have heard of, when the Iron Curtain fell after the Soviet Union, those little republics splintered off and became a confederation. So just loosely tied, loosely organized. The same thing here in our own country during the Civil War. A confederation, a confederacy, was what the southern states, when they split away from the United States, they formed a confederacy. So you've heard about these, and that's what we started out as in 1781. Okay, so we become this new country. We're under this confederation, Articles of Confederation, and the biggest accomplishment of that first form of government was the Northwest Ordinance, which was passed in 1787. So a few years down the road, it had four main pieces to it that helped form this country. It established the rules for west of the Appalachian Mountains. So remember that vast territory that we had won when we defeated the French in the French and Indian War, that still hasn't been organized. So this Northwest Ordinance establishes rules for what that's going to look like as now they're not colonists, now settlers push into that area. They discussed slavery. Slavery existed. They weren't able to get rid of it. When we formed this new country, that was one of the compromises that they made early. It was initially in the Declaration, but they just couldn't get the South to sign. They didn't think with leaving it in. So in the Northwest Ordinance, they say that south of the Ohio River, splitting the country horizontally, we're going to allow slavery. North of the Ohio River, it will not be allowed. So we acknowledge slavery in our formal documents. Our government is allowing it. We're legalizing it. We're legitimizing it, which helps it continue. Another thing, they discuss how you can become a state. So it's about population. So with 5,000 voters in an area, you could have a temporary provisional government. And once you reach 60,000 voters population-wise, then you could apply for statehood. They also just say that any of these new states that are formed are going to be equal to the original 13 colonies. So there won't be any hierarchy. They'll all be equal. Okay, well, this government under the Articles of Confederation has a whole lot of problems, a whole lot of weaknesses. And again, they do this purposefully, consciously, thinking this is what's best. There's no executive. So there's a legislature, but they give that legislature no power. They can't collect taxes. So they have no money. They have no revenue. They're just at the mercy of the individual states to help provide for them. The universal currency that exists is called a continental, and nobody wants it. it's worthless. Nobody trusts it. So you could have, a whole wheelbarrow full and you couldn't buy anything with it. And another problem, which we talked about early, that England had this problem. When you fight a war, you incur debt. And so that helped cause our revolution, because England tried to place those taxes on us and we fought back. But now we, as this brand new country, have debt. We owe wealthy Americans and we owe foreign countries, and they don't want this currency. On top of that, individual states had different currency. So we are in a world of hurt for a variety of reasons. We also didn't create a judicial branch, so there's no way to resolve conflicts between states. So we've just got all these problems and they're mounting. And then sure enough, we see something spark this next phase. So Daniel Shays was a former soldier. He's a farmer, and he's living in Massachusetts, and he and his fellow neighbors and farmers are starting to lose their land because they can't pay their taxes. And that's just not okay. They have fought for this brand new country. Now their literal livelihood is being taken away from them. If they're a farmer and they lose their farm, what are you going to do? How are you going to take care of your family? So they don't know what to do other than take up arms against their state. So sure enough, they do that, and this sparks people to finally acknowledge that there's a problem with this form of government, this confederation, and they report to Philly. They were already requested, but people were just ignoring it, and this they could no longer ignore. So Shays Rebellion is the spark that gets people to head to Philadelphia to report to what becomes called the Constitutional Convention. Okay, so when people came to the Constitutional Convention, they don't know that they're about, well, some people do, but they don't know they're about to write a whole new form of government. They think they're just going to change, reform the Articles of Confederation. But there were a handful of men who had a very different plan in mind and knew that this form of government was never going to make it. And one of those men was my historical crush, James Madison. I have a picture up here. So James Madison, I admire so very much. He becomes our fourth president down the road. But here at this Constitutional Convention, he is a man with a plan. He has studied history. He has studied government. He knows the strengths and weaknesses, and he has designed something and put together something that he feels is going to be the best for this new country. And he creates the three branches. So that triangle, creating an executive branch, which we didn't have under the Articles of Confederation, and a judicial branch, and then giving the legislative branch a whole lot more power. So we went from having practically no government over the states at all, to creating this very strong central government system. So three separate branches. The judicial would interpret the law, the legislators would make the law, and the executive would enforce the law. And those are just, if you just think about those simple things, that really tells you a lot about what each of the branches does. And then within that triangle, then checks and balances, so that in theory, no branch is ever going to be stronger than another. And they could check any kind of power, because they have powers on one another. So the first thing, we've got this, the men who are there, they hear this new plan. The first thing we've got to figure out is, okay, well, what does that legislative branch look like? So a man named Roger Sherman, and he comes up with the Great Compromise. This man, Roger Sherman, saves our country, and specifically our government, repeatedly with his compromises. So the Great Compromise, he takes two different plans, one out of New Jersey, that was like a small state plan, and then one out of Virginia, which was more of the big states plans. So he puts them together. So we create a bicameral legislature, two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the Senate was the New Jersey plan, because they were small states and were worried about getting, gobbled up and overlooked in this new government. So in the Senate, they say, well, we're going to give everybody 2 senators, so everyone is equal. So no matter if you're a large state or you're a small state, everybody gets 2. So that makes small states happy. And then large states get the House of Representatives, because that's going to be based on population. So now they have more power in the House if they're a larger state with a larger population. That compromise is not even dry. The ink's not dry. And the moment they say the House of Representatives is going to be based on population, we have a new ugly problem raise its head. What are we going to do about the slaves? So again, the moment they say this is based on population, the South wants to count their slaves, even though they had previously, again, when we had such a battle at the Second Continental Congress while writing the Declaration of Independence about what to do about the slaves. The South refused to sign the Declaration until Thomas Jefferson agreed to take out something he had written in it originally called the Slavery Clause, in which he condemned the practice of slavery. Even though he himself owned slaves, he knew it was wrong, and he wrote it in the Declaration, which would have paved the way for removing slavery, and we would have never had perhaps a civil war, because it would have worked its way out. So we knew this in 1776. But again, the founding fathers could not figure out a way to get the South to sign on, and they needed them now. They needed to fight, they needed to declare war, and they felt they couldn't solve all the problems at once, and they just needed to unite for the revolution to fight England, and we'd take care of slavery down the road, never imagining how long it would take in the Civil War to come. So we already know this is a problem, and the South refuses to acknowledge back in 1776 that slaves were people. They said they're property. And now suddenly they want to call them people because they want to count them so that they get more representatives in the House. So Roger Sherman again comes up with a compromise, and it's called the 3/5 compromise. So we're not going to let the South count every slave. We're going to let them count 3/5 of a person / the population. So their slaves, by counting them at all, is giving them power, which allows slavery to continue. So it increases the population of the South, giving them more representation, thereby cementing this practice of slavery. So again, our federal government has legitimized it by allowing it. We've created this 3/5 compromise. It's in writing, and we're allowing it to continue into the future. Okay, another extension of slavery given. Okay, there were two camps. Ooh, we're almost there. Excellent. There were two camps with this Constitution. There were a whole lot of founding fathers whose names you know, who were both there and not there. The folks who were at the Constitutional Convention, who were pro-Constitution, who wanted this stronger government, it's exactly what we need. We don't need anything else. This is perfect. Those were folks like George Washington, who then they make the first president, of course. Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, who I mentioned earlier, he comes in with this, he's the man with the plan. And then many of you have gotten to know rather well Alexander Hamilton. He is another proponent. And those four men, being some of the biggest names, they are our Federalists. So Federalists are people who agree with the Constitution as is, as it was originally designed and presented, and they need nothing else. They want a strong central government, and they want to scrap the Articles of Confederation. The other camp are called the Anti-Federalists. They were from states that were wealthy and strong and see no reason to scrap the Articles at all. They didn't need this Constitution. They're fine with the status quo. So those were also some very important names: Thomas Jefferson, Sam Adams. These were our patriots. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. These were men who fought for this country. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration. They do not like this Constitution. They are very worried about giving all of this power to the federal government. They're very concerned about it. My lighting just went crazy because my lights went off. Okay, so the most important thing to know about those men, specifically the Anti-Federalists, is we have them to thank for our Bill of Rights. They're not okay with the Constitution at all, but they insist on a Bill of Rights being written, or they won't ratify it. They won't pass it. They won't agree to it. Okay, so our Bill of Rights, which are individuals' rights, states' rights, we have the Anti-Federalists to thank. They insisted on those being drafted and immediately added the amendments to the Constitution, the first 10, right out of the gate. We will not ratify the Constitution until you give us the Bill of Rights. Back to the Bill of Rights, and the reason I have this historical crush on James Madison. He wrote the Constitution, basically, right? He's the father of the Constitution. He does not think it needs anything else. It's fine the way it is. It's a perfect document. And he's against these anti-federalist arguments. Yet he writes the Bill of Rights. What? We don't have this kind of compromise anymore in our government, haven't for so very long. He doesn't think it's necessary. He doesn't even want it. And yet he also writes the Bill of Rights. So it's pretty incredible what we were able to do. We were not perfect, but we made it through and changed our government from the Articles of Confederation to this new Constitution with our Bill of Rights, which still protects us to this day. We'll be getting into what those Bill of Rights are more down the road. And the Constitution, just to give you a time frame, 1789, full ratification. Okay, all right. So 1776, we declare war. By 1781, we've won. And then by 1789, we've got a whole new form of government, our second form, the Constitution.
Welcome to the end of the video. Let's go back and revisit that question we talked about at the very beginning. How did Americans come together to compromise during the early years of the new nation? What do you think?